Paul Radomski has been working in the world of water for years. He's a lake scientist with Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. For over 30 years, he's worked on these lake management issues, published extensively on ecological and conservation matters. Paul currently serves as the Minnesota's lead scientific expert on lakeshore habitat management issues, and he is the co-author of Lakeshore Living, the book you see on the screen there, that hit the presses in the last couple of years. And we are happy to have Paul with us to talk about barriers to good shoreline stewardship. I'm going to just toggle over to your PowerPoint.
Well, thanks for the invitation to come and speak. I'm going to start my video since I've been requested to. Perhaps you can see me. Been asked to talk about barriers, which is a very interesting topic. One that I've struggled with. Could you go to the next slide, please? So there's two ways to do many things, of course, and I'm going to talk about two ways, a top-down approach or a bottom-up approach. Now, I'm an ecologist, fish ecologist, lake ecologist, and a top-down is predator controls prey. You stock predator fish like walleye, it affects zooplankton, which affects phytoplankton, which has a cascade effect throughout the ecosystem. I am totally unqualified to talk about this issue because what we're really talking about with barriers to good shoreland stewardship is really talking about human behavior. And that's, you need a psychologist, right? So I've been working for, had been working for 5 years on shoreland management. So it's rule-based. There's rules, there's education and enforcement on the rules. Next slide, please. So we spend a lot of time creating good rules that are science-based. We conduct our public meetings, we go through an administrative law judge, we do all the public hearings, etc. And we throw down the rules. Here are the rules, go follow them. Next slide, please. And then we go and communicate the importance of our rules, right? I mean, hey, it's in your best interest. Having good shoreline buffers protects against erosion and a loss of property, a loss of your asset. Next. There are reasons for this, ecological reasons, where the plants, native plants, trees and shrubs have deep root systems. They protect that near shore. Next. And then we give a whole bunch of guidance. Here's Minnesota's Restore Your Shore, a tool, an online tool that helps people based on the site conditions, soil conditions, to select plants that would best suit their particular location, that they could use to create their shoreline, which they're required to by law and rule. Next. And this is a slide from Wisconsin. This is a transition slide, Patrick. So if you hit the next couple buttons, you see as you increase the development of the shoreline and alter that shoreline, by the time you get to a heavily suburban lawn in front of your lake, you're seeing a 7 to 9 times increase in phosphorus pollution from that site. And if everybody on the lake is doing that, you know, you have serious problems, right? So these are the kinds of messages we speak about. Next slide. And then we talk about, you know, habitat, the importance of trees in the water. Trees that grow along the lake, they die sooner or later, and they fall. Not by the force of gravity, mind you, since Einstein has shown the time-space continuum, gravity is not a force. It's just the fact that we have a morphed time-space, and things are drawn to it by that curvature of the space and time. Next slide. But it's important that that habitat is there. And we educate people about the need to have those shoreline buffers that are in the rules, because it's good for wildlife, it's good for fish, And if you don't have it, you're going to attract geese, and you're going to have poorer water quality, and there's going to be less aquatic habitat, all the ramifications of that. Next slide, please. And then, of course, we have enforcement and education of those, enforcement of those rules. So, and this is really challenging for in Minnesota, probably like Wisconsin. The enforcement of state standards are local ordinances, and then they're enforced by the local units of government, counties and cities, et cetera. And they have a really hard time of taking someone to task for not having a shoreline buffer that's stated in their ordinance, stated as a state standard. And a lot of times the county attorney's not interested. They've got murders to deal with. They've got drugs to deal with. These are low priorities, right? So I've spent a lot of time, the DNR in Minnesota has spent a lot of time encouraging buffers through a top-down process. And it's, our rules began shortly after Wisconsin, shoreline rules that went into effect. And through that period of 30, 40 years, we had seen very little positive consequence on that near shore standard effect across Minnesota lakes. Next slide. So the other way of thinking about things is bottom up, right? So as an ecologist, I'm thinking prey controls predator. Classic examples is shallow lakes, where the aquatic plant community has a profound influence on what type of community that is for the rest of the community. And it might exist in two states, a turbid state and a vegetated state. And depending on what state it is, it has a huge implications back to the rest of the community. And from a human perspective and human behavior perspective, it's values-based. So social norms driving what's happening in a community, in an area. Next slide. So social norms, there's a lot of great science on this. I'm a fan of Everett Rogers. He had written a book, Diffusions of Innovations. So whenever you're trying to change a behavior, whether it's farming practice, whether it's any recycling, there is a particular pattern to that. And he's outlined it with this type of graph, very easy to explain. So you've got your innovators, your early adopters. So with recycling, it's often the kids, right? They're the early adopters. They're gonna tell the parents, you know, to recycle. And after a while, you get a critical mass, and through time, you might get near 100% of the population actually doing that actual behavior. Next slide. The one that I often use as an example as a bottom up is BWI. Now, when I was growing up in the 60s, my parents drank way too much point beer. I'm originally from Stevens Point. They would get plastered and come home drunk after driving home. And this was a serious behavior, right? So this is the 60s. And look how long it took for that behavior to change, right? It took organization, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, long periods of time to get something that's had very serious consequence, right? People are dying because of this behavior, but look how long it took government to react and society to move forward, right? My parents, luckily, were somewhat early adopters, and my father quit drinking, and today we still have the problem, right? My brother died from a DWI coming home from Oshkosh one day, so it's still a problem, but I would say that the social norm for drinking while under the influence has dramatically changed. But it did take a long time. Next slide, please. So, you know, think about that social norm and the difficulty of changing behavior and the need to get to some critical mass. I think we are there with DWI, we're there with some recycling, we're there for a lot of environmental issues. But you need to find those innovators. You need to move people to get that critical mass. And that's the next challenge that often we face on these issues. Next slide, please. And how you might do that? Well, there's some good principles of persuading people to do things. Here's a list of 5 based on the book Influence. The 5 things are: you have to like the messenger. People have to make a commitment. And once they make a commitment, they move forward. There must be reciprocity. That encourages an obligation to do something. It's helpful if you're using authority or speaking from authority. And lastly, you want to normalize the good behavior. Next slide, please. So you don't send Paul Radomski in because a lot of times I will offend somebody. You want somebody that can relate to people, who's a good messenger for whatever social norm you're trying to change. Now it might be George Bailey or it might be Mary, right? I don't know about the kid with the curly hair, but somebody that can relate to people and engage those people about why. Somebody that the audience member will relate to. So think about who is the messenger and are they doing the message appropriately? Next one, please. And want to speak to authority or use authority. The best science says, here's a scientist in northern Wisconsin that says this is the best way to manage this particular environmental issue. Use the scientists that are around, that people respect and admire, and use their messages or have them occasionally come in and express that message directly to the folks that you're trying to change their behavior on. Next slide, please. It helps to have a commitment, right? If somebody asks me to do something and I say, I might get to it, but if they really force you to say, well, would you please do it, and would you do it at this time? Often getting a written commitment or some sort of first step in that commitment stage is a good process, right? I mean, there is a reason that weddings do what they do is you get engaged first, right? You make a first commitment and then you move on to and get formally married, right? I mean, there are steps in that process, and the person making that commitment then feels some sense to follow through. Next slide, please. Reciprocity. If you give something for a particular action, often that puts some obligation back on the person that receives that gift to reciprocate, right? So that's an important principle here that you want to consider using. Next slide, please. But you have to be very careful in your communication. You want to normalize the good behavior. So if you say that we've got a big problem or a very frequent problem like this, using this particular slide, you've just normalized it for your audience. The problem now is that this type of management, this shoreline management, is more legitimate. So you have to be very careful in that communication, right? So the science says, focus in on what the in crowd is doing. Like down the road from me is in fishermen, right? The in fishermen, those people that know what they're doing are practicing catch and release, and they know how to do it, right? And that's how they speak to it. So if you're talking about shoreline management or shoreline buffers, and you really realize in your particular lake that it's really not very good or it's pretty poor, you want to say the important people or the in group are protecting and creating shoreline buffers. This is kind of the same science that doesn't normalize suicides in the media, right? Because people are social animals and they'll try to follow the crowd. So you don't want to use messaging that gives the what you think what the bad behavior is. So you want to be very careful. Next slide, please. So you want to normalize the good behavior. This is the good behavior. This is what we like you to see. A little bit on incentives. Incentives need the social norm. And if you're just relying on the incentive only, that can create problems, right? So having tax or money incentives for good stewardship morphs the thinking of people that are receiving the incentive. Now they're going to do if they're doing good stewardship as a choice because of a dollar value that was placed on that action, now they might not have a moral or social obligation to do that. So the end result, it could be demotivating. What you need to emphasize is the moral and social norms first, then considering adding incentives afterwards. Next slide. So I'm going to run through a quick example, a local example in Minnesota here that Dorothy Whitmer used. In this presentation, there's a web link there, is online if you want to actually see Dorothy's complete presentation. But I'm just going to show you the examples here that she used. Next slide, please. So she used a three-step process of quizzing people on the lake, Lakeshore Association members, a site visit and award. Next slide. So the first step, she used authority. She said, here, Minnesota DNR created Shore the Score. She simplified it greatly, but said, you know, here are the things that are good shoreland stewardship techniques. If the people took the quiz, she asked for a commitment to get a site visit, especially those high scoring ones that did really well on their shoreland stewardship. Then she went and visited the site, gave them additional guidance, and then those people that had great sites, they got an award. So they got some obligation then to do good. So it's great feedback loop. Next slide. And then they got the award was a sign that they placed in front of their property. So, and then they advertised where are people doing the right thing on the Gull Lake chain. And then people would actually travel around looking at the different sites. So really positive three-step process that uses the principles of persuasion to get people moving in a great direction. And Dorothy's doing great work. Next slide. So the conclusion is what we're dealing with on stewardship is talking about social norms. And you need to use the principles of persuasion to get people to move in that positive direction. Positive for water quality, positive for all the things that we know that we need to change. You need to be careful in how you're communicating that, right? When the IRS says everybody's cheating on their taxes, what they find is more people start cheating on their taxes because that's the social norm then, right? So be careful in the communication that you're talking when you start talking with people, and emphasize the good behaviors in your communication. And again, and lastly, you have to play the long game here. Just like with DWI, it takes a long time to change behavior. And there's going to be a lot of small little barriers for people to change their behaviors. You can think about shoreline buffers. There's a lot of different behaviors that are going to really be difficult for some people to move to. And understanding those small little behaviors along the way will help you play that long game. So that's, next slide, please. I think that's all I had. And I think I have just a short period of time for questions, but feel free to email me or get in touch with me and let me know if I can help in any way.
Thanks. Go ahead, Bob.
It occurs to me that you might need all of those principles to have a successful outcome, but you might only need one of those principles being not followed to have an unsuccessful outcome. It seems like there's a greater weight on the negative side than on the positive side.
That's very true. That's a very good point. You want to hit every one of those principles. You want to hit them hard, and you can be tripped up very easily. So it's very helpful to think through those through those steps. Build on people, on experiences that have worked in other places. The Gull Lake example. There are things that Dorothy knows that she would do differently next time around. And so talk to other lake associations and figure out what's working and how they might change it, and then build on it. And I think overall in Minnesota, I think we're getting near to a critical mass, and that's a good thing.
Well, thanks very much, Paul. I think we've come up against your time. I've learned some things of how to move forward in working with shoreline property owners and more effectively. So thank you very much for